This is COMP2106, Advanced Server-Side Scripting. This is week 9 or week 10, depending on if you include reading week. Today, we're going to be covering React, which is the last bit of the MERN stack that we have not covered yet. So we're going to be using a tool called Create React App to scaffold out our project in the same way that we use Express Generator for an Express application, just to make our lives a little bit easier. So, kind of just quickly go over React. So what is React? So React, it's an open source JavaScript library that's created by Facebook. As you guys have, some of you guys have used Vue. There's also another one that's called Angular that's created by Google. And all of them aim to try to make front-end development a lot easier. So as you guys have seen when we're using PugJS, you can create all these templates, but the issue is when you want to change what is on the page, you have to hard refresh the page. Whereas some other tools that have been used in the past is like jQuery to help manipulate the DOM, but in a large-scale application, it starts to get a little bit unmanageable. So as I said, it's used for front-end applications, but there are some tools that are coming out that you can actually develop stuff a little bit beyond a front-end application. So you can do server-side rendering in the same way that we're using Pug. So it's sent from the server, and then it's updated on the front end, as well as there's some tools like Gatsby, which will actually generate static markup based on your React application. So that way it's really pretty quick. You can throw it into a CDN, and it's really a lot cheaper. And the other big benefit of React is that it's easy to use reusable components by implementing a HTML similar syntax, which we'll go over, called JSX. So how does it compare to what we've been using with Pug, as well as some other ones like EJS and handlebars? It's dynamic after it's sent from the server. So unlike Pug, like I just said, you have to refresh to get different view. You can update it on the client side without having to refresh the page. You can also reuse a React front end with any backend. So you can use React with PHP, you can use React with C#, you can use it with Node. In this case, it makes sense to use it with Node just because you're in a full JavaScript stack, but you're not, it doesn't really matter because it all exists in the front end. But like Pug, EJS, and handlebars, it does have some similar principles of being able to give it variables in and then dynamically change the content. So you'll see kind of in the way that we have used mix-ins in some ways is kind of more like a React component. So how does React help? So React, as well as some other libraries, use what is called a virtual DOM. So it's a little bit complex to fully understand how like React uses a virtual DOM, but basically it's a JavaScript representation of what the DOM looks like. So when you right-click on a page and do inspect element, all of those nested tree structure of HTML tags, that is the DOM. So what React does is it keeps a JavaScript representation of what everything looks like, and then when you want to change something, it's a lot easier to compare two virtual DOM trees to view differences than it is to manipulate the DOM in itself, because updating the DOM can be quite slow because it's synchronous. So instead, we can do a virtual DOM and do things a lot quicker. So it also helps by allowing components to manage their own state. So instead of having, I'm sure you guys have seen in different applications, you have either constants or like application level variables that get passed around. In this case, if you have, let's say like an accordion dropdown, that accordion dropdown can keep its own state of knowing if it's open or closed. The entire application doesn't really need to know that, but you can keep it inside of your accordion to kind of limit the complexity of your application, which can be quite handy. And then components are also able to share their state with anything that is a child of it. There are some other ways that you can do it, but this is the most simplistic and usually the best practice to do it. And then the other thing that React does is it can help separate front end from the back end. So as you guys have seen with our model view controller, you have your model that is used for, has a schema of what your data looks like, and it has all the functions for grabbing data passed to your controller that does some more logic, and then your view that is used for presentational purposes. So in this case, what you can do is you can have a front-end application that requests data from an API in the same way that we request data from a controller. So it can sometimes make it a little bit easier so that way you can have a back-end application or an API, REST API, that will be developed outside of the application. So you can have two different applications. So what is the virtual DOM? I kind of just went over it, but it's a JavaScript-based representation of the actual DOM. It's faster to compare changes between virtual DOMs, and it's able to contain its own state, and it uses reconciliation to make changes to the physical DOM. So if you end up making a change in a component, but the actual presentational part doesn't change, it will not change it if that's how you set it up. So it makes it a little bit faster at being able to update than you make one change in your application, the entire thing re-renders. So you'll see where this comes into being useful when we actually use it. So with React, the easiest way to use it is using something called JSX. So JSX is a HTML-like syntax for writing React components, and you use a JavaScript preprocessor to convert it into regular JavaScript. So I don't know if you guys have ever heard of like Parcel or Webpack or anything like that. What it ends up doing is it is run on your code that you end up writing, your source code, and it ends up converting it into something else. So in this case, it converts it into JavaScript functions from HTML tags. Because at the end of the day, when you're writing JSX, you're kind of writing a pseudo version of JavaScript, which can get sometimes a little bit confusing if you're not used to it. But at the end of the day, I'll show you guys on, I believe it's, the next slide, it shows a comparison of the two. And because it's a shorthand syntax, it's a lot easier to read the source code of the application. So here is two examples of a class. So there's two ways that you can write a element or like a component in React. So you can either do what is called a functional component, or you can do a class component. So the top one is a class that's called hello that extends off of react.component, and it returns react.createElement. The first part is what type of HTML element you want to render. In this case, it's a div. The second one is any properties that you want to pass to it. So in this case, it's just passing null. And then the third one is what is called the children, or what ends up getting rendered inside of it. So hello, this props dot, or sorry, this dot props dot to what, and then down below it uses React DOM render and ends up rendering that element. So you can see over here we end up actually rendering out hello, which is our component up top, and it passes in the prop of to what. So that way when it ends up getting rendered out, it'll just say hello world. However, that can get quite unmanageable very quickly. So JSX is the one on the bottom where it just renders a div tag, and then it puts in the this.props.toWhat, and then down below you can see that we just pass a property in the same way that you would any other HTML element of toWhat world. So both of these are equivalent, but the bottom one is a lot easier to read and a lot easier to continue to maintain in the future. So that comes into state and props. So in this case, in back here, to what is under props. So props are things that are passed to a component that you can either do rendering off of or do some sort of like calculation, conditional rendering, stuff like that. Whereas state exists inside of a component. And state, when state is inside of a component, it can be changed. So if you have like a counter application and you want to calculate how many times a button has been clicked, every single time that you click the button, you would change the state by incrementing it by 1. However, props are what are passed to a different component. So in this case, if you had a component that's just called number display, you might pass that number value to it as a prop to be able to register or to display it on the screen. So props typically exist elsewhere in the application as state, but it's not always a state value. Sometimes it can be a function or something else, but it is quite common that props are passed from somewhere else that exists as state. And that's actually just the quick overview of React. I figured that you guys might prefer me to just kind of show you guys how React works rather than going over slides of it. So what I'm going to use is, I had mentioned before, so Vue, you guys have used the Vue CLI, and it makes it easy to scaffold out a project. So what I'm going to use is create React app. I'm going to use npx. So npx is a way of running something without having to install it globally on your computer. Okay, apparently I cannot have it in a folder. Sorry? Maybe. Or no, I thought we just continued on. The only issue with it is that I can't have a project with a capital letter. So I'm just going to remove week 9. And then make dir week 9. So now I'll run that. So there's a couple different libraries that are used in React when you're working with stuff. So there's the core React package, which is basically what ends up being able to have state, make changes when something changes. There's React DOM, which is used for being able to render React onto the DOM. Yep.
What did you type?
I typed in npx space create dash react dash app and then a period for doing the current folder that you're in. And if I zoom this out, you'll see that it comes with in the same way that when we scaffold out an Express application and it tells us to run npm install, this does kind of the same thing, so it gives you all the different commands that you have. So this might be a little bit confusing at first, but Yarn is kind of like npm. It's created by Facebook, and back when Yarn was originally created, it was a lot faster than npm. You don't have to use Yarn. We're just going to still use npm. And all these commands just replace Yarn with npm. So in this case, it might have already installed it, but I'm just going to do it anyway. So I'm going to type in npm install, and it will install any dependencies that I need. And I'll just go over these different ones that are here. So there's yarn start, which is for starting the development server. There's yarn build, which is used for taking all of the files that you've just created, and it generates static files for production. So this is what would be used when you end up hosting a site on anywhere. like Heroku or AWS or something. There's yarn test, which is for, have you guys gone over what is called test-driven development before? Or have you guys written like unit tests or anything like that before? Couple nods. We won't go, we're not gonna write any tests for this. It's not necessary. Then there's also eject. Eject is more, if I open up the project, it should be done. So as you can see, there's not actually a whole lot here that you can visually see. And if we open up our package JSON, instead of using nodemon or node, it's using this React scripts. So there's a lot of stuff that's actually hidden behind the scenes that you don't need usually to interact with. But when you eject the application, it gives you a lot more manual control over how the project is working. But chances are there's nothing in this class that we're going to be needing to eject the application. They've actually made it a lot easier to work with it as a version 2. Then was there, I think there was one other. Nope. So by doing this, I can now just type in npm start, and it runs React script start, starts up the development server, and similar to our Express application, it's going to be running on port 3000. So you're greeted with just the React logo that spins, and it says that you can edit source app.js and save, and it has what is called hot module reload. So when you make a change, you don't have to refresh the screen. It will just automatically put it to the screen. So if I open up app.js, and here I'm going to, yeah, it will probably take a while being the first time that you're running it, and it has to download everything. I'm just kind of like showing you how it plays with different things. So you can see right here, we have our component that is rendering HTML to the page. So if I change edit to test and I click save, you'll see that now it says test. So without me having to do anything. So if I right-clicked and went to inspect, you can see here we have our div with a class of app, which is right here. You might be a little bit confused why it says class name. So because we're working in JavaScript and working with JSX is JavaScript, class is a protected keyword. We went over that in like week 1 or 2 of protected keywords that are inside of JavaScript. So it can't actually use the word class. It's used right here. So instead they use class name, which at the end of the day, when it gets converted into actual HTML that's rendered on the page, it automatically handles that. But you can see that we have our div right here with a class of app. Then we have a header. We have an image tag, which is rendering a logo, which comes from up here. Then we have a paragraph tag, anchor element, and that's it. So this all ends up getting converted into HTML. Pretty straightforward. But is there any questions on that? Hopefully not the actual mechanics of how it ends up getting converted at the end of the day, because that would be class in on itself. But you can see how when you write a React component, how it does end up converting it to HTML. However, we haven't done anything officially with this app.js file. If we open up index, this is where it ends up grabbing what is called the entry point of our application, which is app.js. So it imports it, import app from app, and then we end up rendering it. So it uses document.getElementById, and it finds root. If I open up our index.html, you can see right here. So we have a div with an ID of root. So if I opened up view page source, this is actually the exact same thing, but anything that has been added with JavaScript will not show up in the page source. It will only show up in an inspect element, which is why there's some different tools out there for what are it's called server-side rendering. So is anyone having issues getting Create React app working on their machine? Still waiting on it or still waiting? It's slow.
After you create, install again?
You might be able to just try running npm start, and if that doesn't work, then do npm install. But for everything that we're going to be doing, we don't need to modify index.html. We probably do not need to edit index.js, except to remove actually, no, we don't need to remove this anymore. So does anyone know what a service worker is? Okay. So React comes with a service worker, and what that does is it has a comment right above that says if you want your app to work offline and load faster, you can change unregister to register below. Note this comes with some pitfalls. Learn more about service workers here, and they have like a little link that you can do. But essentially what it does is on browsers that support a service worker, it can cache resources and save them for offline. So that way if you end up opening an application and you're on spotty internet, while it might not be able to make calls to get the data, the general interface would still boot up and you'd be able to see it, which is pretty handy. However, as it says, it does come with some pitfalls and you have to be able to work with it. We're not going to be going over service workers, so you can just end up keeping it here. The one thing that I am going to do is I'm going to be, actually, I guess I'll keep the CSS. When it comes to writing CSS for like React applications, there are unfortunately a bajillion different ways that you can do it. So you can write normal CSS like this, or you can there's some what are called CSS in JS solutions, so that way it automatically handles class names. If you open up Facebook and go into inspect, you'll see here that a lot of these class names like don't make sense, like _3 UBP and then _SG2. The reason why, as you can imagine, designers and developers are not calling their class names these. What they are is they're automatically generated when you build the project. So that way you don't have any sort of like collisions where you've already used that class name before. With a lot of applications that you guys have used before, you're probably not writing like thousands or hundreds of thousands of different class names, where something like Facebook would. So what they end up doing is it's just automatically generated class names. And in here, in app.js, we're just importing the CSS. So what ends up happening is when you import it and this gets rendered, it throws it up at the top as just a regular style tag with the CSS inside of it. So there's a couple other things that you can do. There's something called CSS modules. And what this does is it allows you to create your class name inside of your CSS, but when you import it, you want to specifically import that class name that's right here. So you could end up writing CSS that's specific for a component, but when it ends up getting rendered, it's a different class name. So it's kind of some examples of what you can do. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it. But I think just to make it easier, we'll probably just use just regular CSS and just import it in. So with that being said, I'm going to delete some of these files that are not as important. So I'm going to remove app.test. I'm going to remove index.css. I'm going to remove logo SVG. I'm going to remove service worker. And inside of index, I'm going to remove the line that imports the CSS and imports the service worker and the lines that end up using it. So I am going to create a GitHub repo. Am I missing something? Oh, inside of app, we need to remove where we use the logo. So I'm going to remove the logo there, and I'm going to remove the image tag that's rendering the logo. So now I'm going to, because now it's loading, I'm going to go to GitHub, and I'm going to create my repository that if for some reason it's not working on your guys' end, you can just download mine and run it on your machine.
Can you just, sorry, can you go over what you moved there?
Yep. We removed app.test.js. We removed index.css. We removed serviceworker.js. And then we also removed the logo.svg. So when you remove those files, then inside of index.js, you have to remove the line that says import index.css. And then you have to remove the import star as service worker from service worker. And then that big 3-line comment with the service worker unregister, you have to remove that as well.
And it should say like go compile.
Should still say that. There's one other thing that you have to remove, and it's inside of your app.js.
And it's that image.
Yes, exactly. And then, is it rendering now?
Yeah.
So it should look like this on your screen?
Yeah.
Cool. Is anyone else having any issues so far using Create React App? All right.
I'm getting failed to compile.
Is it saying why it's failing to compile? All right. So I'm going to push this up now. So this is going to be COMP2106. Oop. COMP2106 dash winter 2019 dash week 09. So create it. The one thing that's actually a little bit handy when you initially run Create React App is it will automatically do your initial commit of your React application. So you can see here, so you can see here that in my editor, it tells me that I have changes that I've made. So that's why I have an X and I'm running on master. And inside of Visual Studio Code, you can see that I have 7 changes that are here. If this was not automatically created as a Git repo, I wouldn't have any changes because it wouldn't know. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add everything and do a git commit of remove unneeded files. And then I'm going to add the remote branch, and then git push u, capital U, origin, master. No, lowercase u, I guess. There we go.
Is there something related to CSS that you have to
Sorry?
I just have an error that says
Index.css?
for source index.css.
Yes, so inside of index.js, it is, I believe, line 4. It's importing index.css. You can just remove that line because it's trying to import something that doesn't exist anymore that we've deleted. So if I open up app, what one thing that this does not have as of right now is we don't have the ability to use multiple different pages. So I'm trying to think of a good example. Actually, I think the React docs is a good example. So in here, if I click on option 2 for introducing JSX, you'll see that it does not refresh the page. It doesn't go white and then stuff flashes in. It just changes. So the way that they go about this, and here's the other thing, you'll see actually in the top, it's still changing what page we're on. So this uses a couple different technologies altogether. Browsers have what is called a history API. So if I right click on here, in my back, you can still see all the pages that I've just been coming to and from. And what's really interesting is through JavaScript, you can actually push, like an array, stuff into your history. So you can say that you went from this page to this page to this page, even though at the end of the day, you never actually did a hard refresh. So what React has is another library, and there's two different ways that you can go about it. Like React, you have to install libraries to add functionality, which can be a little bit confusing at first, whereas libraries like Angular will give you everything that you need. Whereas React is very tiny. They have what are called like mono repos that kind of do like one thing and that's it. But it uses React Router DOM. Let's go right here. So this is the typical library that most people will use when they're wanting to do routing inside of their application. So we can install this. There's also another one. I've never used it before, but it's actually quite popular. It's called Reach Router. But, oh, this is the one I want. So it doesn't have as many installs, but from what I've seen on their website, it's a little bit easier to work with. Unfortunately, if you end up trying to find tutorials, and this is where I talked about in the beginning of the year, if you try to find a tutorial for React Router, make sure that it is React Router v4 and not v3, because they are different and it's a little bit confusing. So inside of our terminal, I'm just going to do npm install /save React Router DOM, and that's dash between them. So now that's installed. And inside of our app, there's 3 things that we want to require in. So there's browser router, route, and link. We actually only need to probably use 2, which is browser router and route. And then you do from React Router DOM. Has anyone in here before used the syntax of import from as opposed to when we've used express using require? Has anyone done that before? No. So using import, and then there's also another one that's called export. It's similar to require that we use in Express. That uses something that's called CommonJS, whereas import and export are going to, hopefully, be implemented in JavaScript. It's just in proposals. So I can't, actually, it might even, no, I don't think it's fully done yet. It's in, there's different draft modes of different proposals, but what this allows us to do is using future syntax, and it will automatically convert it for us using a tool called Webpack. So it will automatically handle it for us, and it makes it, I find the syntax is a little bit better.
Sorry, Chris, what did you put in the command prompt?
In the command was npm install /save React Router DOM. So one other thing that using create React app is has anyone ever heard of linting before? Linting code? No? So what linting is it is a tool that will look at all of your source files and end up finding different rules that have been set up usually for like common best practices. So you can, in JavaScript, it is optional to put a semicolon at the end of a line, and you can set up a rule that says it will enforce and give warnings in your editor if you have not put a semicolon at the end of a line, or you could enforce it and say that you do not want semicolons. So you'll see right here, sometimes you might get a compiled with warnings. That's totally okay. In this case, it's telling me that I have imported browser router and route. It says it's defined but is never used. So I've just imported it into the application, but I haven't used it yet. So, yeah. So inside of here, I'm just going to remove everything that's in here except for the div class name app. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use our browser router and then do a route of, what is it? Sorry, there's several different syntaxes for this. React router DOM. Route, it's path. Okay. So what we can do is do route path equals slash, and then we'll do I'm going to create a folder that is going to be called pages and create index.jsx.
In the source folder?
Correct. So it'll go source pages. You could do it outside of it if you wanted to. It's really preference. I just figured because source will be everything that will be the source code of your application, those pages are a part of that source code. So, and then I'm going to import index page from pages/index. So this part of importing can be a little bit confusing. There are two types of exporting in, not in React, but how we're going to be doing our React applications. There is what is called a default export. And this is where you can see up above when we import from React, React itself is not in the curly braces. So that means that there is a default export, and you can name it whatever you want. However, component, browser router, and route are all named exports. So that means that when you're importing from React Router DOM, you specifically want to pull out the browser router and the route. You can, of course, name it something else if you, for some reason, wanted to. What a lot of people will do is do import browser router as router, and then you can just reference it as router down below. So there's a couple different ways that you can do it, just like everything. I'm sure you guys are kind of sick of all the different ways that you can do something. It's sometimes nice if there's just one way to do something. And just like multiple ways to do something, inside of our route, there are 3 different ways that we can use a component. We're just going to go with the basic one. So what is happening right now inside of our application, without adding any more complexity right now, is that we are just rendering a div. That's pretty easy. This router, what it does is it will wrap our application, and we can actually we're going to put one other thing in it just to make it, of course, more confusing. But what router does is it ends up looking at the URL and determining which route inside of the router it should render to the page. So we don't have to do any crazy logic of parsing the URL and then figuring out which route we want to render. That is automatically handled for us. What we are going to include is what is called a switch. Who here is familiar with like a switch in regular, any programming language? Do you want to tell me, how does the switch work?
Oh, it's, well, if I'm remembering this right, a switch is almost like an if loop, except it's taking in conditions or cases, as it's called in a syntax.
Yeah.
Like, if this case is this, then execute this. Otherwise, if it's this, then execute this. And if it's anything else, then just execute this by default.
Exactly. So a switch case is kind of like really if you have like a lot of if statements, sometimes it's easier to use a switch case. But the big thing with a switch case is that unless if you make it, when you always use a break, it will not execute any other code that is in that switch case. And that's actually what this switch does, is if for some reason you have two paths that match, it will render both of them. So what we want to do is we only ever want to render one route based on our switch. So we can use a switch like this, put our route inside of it. And now if we had two different routes that are using different components, it will only render the first one that it finds. So
is capital beginnings, is that the syntax for all this stuff then?
yes, that's pretty typical. So a React component typically will always start with a capital letter and be what is called Pascal case, as opposed to camel case. Functions, stuff like that, are camel case. But a component, something that is going to be rendered, is always with a capital letter. So what I would also recommend, and we haven't done this yet, is hopefully everyone is using like Chrome or Firefox. There is a really useful tool for debugging your applications in React. It's called React Dev Tools. You can see it right here. It has like the little React symbol, and it says, this page is using the production build of React. And in this case, this one is now red, and it says that I'm using the development build. But if I opened up Inspect Element, went to my React tab, you'll see here that now it's showing all of my React components in the same way that looking at elements does for displaying your regular DOM elements. So this is really useful for being able to see. You can see here I have props and I have state. But being able to inspect your application and being able to understand how everything is flowing is super useful. So I would recommend installing this, even if you don't know how to use it or even won't use it today. Going forward, we probably will end up using it to debug why something is or is not working. So we've set up a lot of stuff, but we're still not rendering a page yet. So we've imported index page from pages/index. The other thing that I'll also say is you don't have to put .js as your extension, because it's assumed that it's going to be either a JS file or a .jsx file. Doesn't matter which one you use. You can use JSX or JS. I just prefer to use JSX. So lastly, on our route, we want to say which component we're using. I believe it's component. And then we put in our index page and just say, like, that's what we're wanting to use. One sec. Yeah, it is component. Cool. You can also do some other stuff, which we'll probably go over. But right now, you'll see that I'm getting an error. So this is because inside of our page that we created for index, we aren't, A, we're not exporting anything, and B, we're not exporting a React component. So now here comes writing our first React component. So as I mentioned, there's two different ways that you can create a React component. There is a class component that gives you what are called lifecycle methods. And then there is a functional component, which until recently, it could not house its own state. It didn't have access to knowing when it was updated or would be updated and stuff like that. So right now, I'm just going to do a functional component to show you the difference between that and our app.js. So we're going to have to do import React from React. And also, do you guys want me to bump up the font size at all? Would that be helpful? It's fine? I'll just bump it up anyway. Okay. So we import React from React, and then we'll create a constant called index, which is going to be a function. And then down below, we want to export default index. So those are the three main things that you'll need to do for your functional component. But our index page is not actually giving any sort of HTML. So what we need to do is return, and then we want to do a div and just say hello world. So now, if I open up Google Chrome, you'll see that we have hello world. But if I go to a different part of our application and just do like test, ooh, that is working because I don't have an exact right there. Now we're not rendering anything. Yes?
Is there an extension you have for VS Code for working with React? Because I'm getting lots of red squigglies, but it's working. But it's like underlining.
What is it underlining?
It's underlining the div and hello.
Do you have it?
Like,
What does it say?
missing semicolon, expected an assignment for function call instead.
Oh, okay. So that is. Hold on. Let me just come over and look. It'll just be 1 second.
Just to see if we can do it. Okay. So what it's probably doing is just do this. I'm giving you terminal index page.
Component equals index page. I'll do that.
Yeah. Interesting. It's like the linters. Maybe just suggest try closing the history and reopening.
Because it shouldn't be doing that. I'll show you, Matt.
In the route, it's component. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got that.
So you have component equals index page, and it's yelling at you saying that it's not used.
Yeah, it's saying in line 3 though.
Yeah, line 3, import index page from pages index.
Yeah.
Okay. But is it working for both of you?
I just got a blank page.
You just have a blank page.
Oh, no, mine's working. It's still, I restarted it, still got that.
It still does it. Sometimes the linter tools can be a huge headache. I'm not sure if it's because I have something. Oh, here's a question. So you're using Visual Studio Code. You see at the bottom right here where it says JavaScript React?
Yeah.
Does yours say that?
Yeah.
Nah, I have no idea then. I'm sorry. That's the best I could try. Yeah, I have a bunch of extensions that are installed. Trying to think if there's anything here. I don't have like many React things installed. I passed one. This one is snippets right here.
Yeah.
So this is snippets. So if I type in IMR, it will automatically import React for me. It's just shorthand syntax stuff. Let's see. IntelliSense, material themes icon, mermaid preview, npm IntelliSense, path IntelliSense, post CSS, prettier Python. Styling, to do, trailing, VS Code, React Refact? No, that won't be it. Nope. I only have 2 things that are like React specific, and neither of them would do that. So I don't know.
So what should be on the page right now? Just hello world?
Correct. So if I show my screen, oh, hold on. Let me go to not/test. So it just says hello world. That's all I have on my screen. No?
No. It's from that import line.
So I put in exact path. Yeah, that's not necessary.
I still have browser router though. Is that okay?
You can still use router. So if I, hold on, let me just remove that for anyone that has kept it the same. So router, save that, refresh, it's still there, still good.
Is component
Okay.
Nope, it's getting an error.
You were just getting an error. Okay. Well, it's top of the hour. Let's take a quick 10, 15-minute break, and I'll try to help out anyone that has some issues. Because we're introducing a new technology, of course, there's always going to be some hiccups with it. It should be fairly straightforward, a lot of these things, just because we're doing some pretty basic stuff. So it might just be like something small that's missing. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the code that I've just done, so index page plus router, and push that up to GitHub. So if there's anyone that needs to pull down my code, you're more than welcome to. And I'll just kind of walk around and see if there's anyone that I can help out. So Okay. So what we've done right now, to recap, is we've imported browser router, which we're using to take the browser's routing to determine which route to display. We've used a switch, which will render the first route that matches the condition of the URL. And we've created a single route on just slash with a rendering a component of index page. So up here, we've imported our page from our pages folder called index. And yeah, so we've put it in. So if we wanted to create a second page, we could do the exact same thing. I'm going to create a page that's called users. Just reason being is that is what is scaffolded out when we do a Express application. And I'm going to do the exact same thing that we used in our index.jsx file. So I'm going to import React from React. I'm going to create a constant called users that is an anonymous function that returns a div called users page. And then I'm going to export default users. So very similar to what we did in our index page, but just displaying a difference of just saying users page instead of hello world. And then inside of our app, I'm going to copy it so that I have slash users. And I want to import the users page. And I want to use that users page on the user's route or the user's path. So if you save that, I'm also going to put on word wrap because you guys said that it's helpful. So on. Ooh. Okay. So now if we open up our application and we have refresh that, we have hello world. If we go to slash users, we have our users page. But the whole point of using something like React, any front-end framework, is that you shouldn't have to hard refresh the page to get what should be displayed on the screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of create like a mini nav bar. So actually what I will do is we're going to, I know we said that we weren't going to, but I'm going to modify our index.html and we're going to just import Bootstrap just for easiness. So Bootstrap, import, documentation. I want to copy the CSS, which I'll put right here. And I also want to import all the JS. One thing that a lot of people tell you is that because you're using something like React, you don't typically need to use jQuery, but just to get Bootstrap working, we have to include jQuery. So we could probably not include it just because jQuery is typically used for like their drop downs and stuff like that. But it just makes it a little bit easier. So now I'm going to copy their nav bar. So I'm going to take the nav bar that's right here, copy it. And here I'm going to create a component that is solely for the nav bar. So if I'm going to create a new folder that's going to be called components. So typically, your components are what are going to be reused across multiple pages. And then your pages is what is specific of what gets rendered on that page. So in here, I'm going to create a file that's called navbar.jsx, import React, create a constant called navbar, paste that in, and export default navbar. And for some reason, it looks like what they give you doesn't work by default. I'm just going to remove, don't need the form. Oh, sorry, I know why. It's because so here's something that is a little bit different from HTML to writing JSX. So it might even just be considered invalid HTML, but when you have an input is what is considered a self-closing tag, meaning that you don't have an opening and a closing tag. It's just one block that's there. Inside of JSX, it will yell at you if you don't self-close your tag, because it will assume that you're using something that will have what is called children inside of it. But in this case, we're actually not using the form, so we can just remove it, save. I'll just keep all this for now. So we've created our navbar just by copying what's on Bootstrap. And what I can do is in our page, I'm going to import our navbar from, and then want to go back, go to components, and navbar. And then inside of our div, I'm going to render our navbar, and then do another div that says hello world. So now we have a div with the navbar inside of it. And now if I load the index page, I now have a navbar. The only thing that is not useful, kind of similar to what we did in our Express application, is we don't want to have to import that navbar on every single page that we're going to be using. We want to have one kind of base that we can do everything off of. So, but the way that is pretty common to go about it in React is we still do have to import something into every component that we use. But in this case, we're going to be creating what is called a layout component. And this will actually be our first introduction to using props. So this is actually a pretty good point to use that. So if I create a component called layout, then it'll be .jsx, going to import React, create layout, and instead of just being in empty parentheses for our anonymous function, I'm going to put props in there. And then same thing, we use the curly braces, and we export default layout. So our layout component is going to be used in all of our pages, and this is where we can start passing in properties of saying, instead of using res locals logged in like we did for switching the button between logged in and log out, what we're going to do is we can pass a prop inside of layout that will get passed to our navbar to switch if we're logged in or logged out. So what we're going to do is just create a div. So return div. And we want to import our navbar from the same folder that we're in. So we can just do /. We want to render our navbar. And then there's something that React does. So inside of here, let's pretend for a moment that div is a React component that we just created. So in here we have our opening tag, and we have our closing tag, and we put the navbar inside of it. And this is what is called children. So a navbar would belong to the div. So in this case, inside of our div, what we want to do is we also want to render anything that is passed to the layout after our navbar. So we just type in props.children. And what this means is when we use our layout component, anything that is put inside of it will be rendered right below the navbar. And in order to render it, we end up using these squiggly brackets because it's going to be a property that's passed to it instead of it being an actual React component. So now, instead of using our navbar like this, we can now remove the import. We're going to import layout from components layout. And now I'm going to create layout. And move hello world inside of it. That. So now when I'm on here, we have hello world. If I go to users, not using our layout, it's not going to have the navbar. But if I do the exact same thing inside of our page here, I'm going to import layout from components layout, change this to layout div, and now when I go back, we now have our users page and our home page. So now that we have our one source of truth through our navbar, we can now start manipulating it and being able to use React links instead of using a regular anchor tag. So first, let's just change the current ones that are here. So I'm just going to get rid of this, get rid of this dropdown, get rid of the disabled one. And I'm just going to put 2 pages. We're going to have a list item for home and a list item for users. And this one is going to go to /users, and this one's going to go to / for our index. So now we have home, we have users, we have home, users. But the one thing that you can notice is up here, you can see the little spinning that changes little quick flash as we swap between them. What React router DOM that we implemented for our browser router switch and route, they also have one that's called link. And what that does is it uses the history API that I had mentioned earlier to push us to the new page, and React will automatically recognize that we just went to a new page and render the correct route. So I'm going to separate this out a little bit first. I'm actually going to decrease the font size because it's a little hard to work with, maybe 16. So instead of having a li with an anchor tag inside of it and then the name of it, what I'm going to do just for consistency is I'm going to create a component up at the top. So I'm going to call it navlink. It's going to receive props. And we're going to return this same stuff down below. And now I can just register 2 navlinks. instead of the repetitive code that was there before. Now, of course, the only issue is now we have 2 homes. So does anyone want to just quickly shout out what 2 things we'll have to change in order to make it reusable? Anyone? So the first one that we're going to want to be able to do is change what the title of the nav link is going to be. So right now we have it hard-coded to being home. And we could either, in the same way that we used layout, where we give it children, we could do it like that so that when we use a nav link, we could just say we want nav link home. We could do it like that. Or we could use a property that's called, we could make our own properties. We could call it title, and that would be what would be displayed inside of it. So I'm going to go and use the property title and say props.title. And then down below, I can say title equals, and this is a string, so I'm going to have home, and title equals users. So now when I save that, I now have home and users. Both of them are going to the exact same page. So there's one other property that I have to change, which is the href in our anchor tag. But before I end up changing that, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to import our link property to use the React router DOM link. So still have it open here. Where's link? So there's actually 2 different links that you can use. There's what's called a nav link, and then there's just what is a regular link. Nav link can actually be pretty useful, where if you give it a where it's going to link to, it actually has a active property. So what you can do is it will automatically register knowing that it's on the correct page, and how Bootstrap displays to you in bold. Let's see, right here, it just adds the property active. You can do the exact same thing and it automatically handles it for you. But I'm just going to use link for now. So I'm going to import link from React router DOM. And instead of using an A, I want to use link. And instead of using href, we use 2. The other thing that I'm going to do, I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but if we look at our application and inspect, we actually have some console warnings of using the term class. As I mentioned earlier, class is a protected word, so we have to convert everything that says class into class name. So I'm just going to do a find and replace and just go class name equals replace all, and now I don't have to worry about it. So if I save that, you'll see that it's gone now. So the other property that I'm going to now do is going to be props.to for our link. So down here, I'm going to do 2/ and 2 users. So now our nav link has a title of home and it links to /, and then we have a nav link of title of users and it links to users. So now if I open this, refresh. So now you'll see up top, we're not hard refreshing anymore. So now I can just click, and if I open this up, you'll see all here. Now the one thing that you might be curious about is that when we mount our application, we end up mounting to a div with the ID of root. But I'm sure, as you guys know, there's a lot of information that gets used inside of our head, such as like what the title of the page is going to be, stuff like that. However, by default, you cannot do that in React. You can't change it. But there is a library that's created by the NFL that's called React Helmet, go figure, that allows you to being able to change what is in the head of our application. Oh, not that.
See, it's built by the NFL?
Yeah.
Like the actual National Football League? Or
Yeah.
somebody called NFL?
No, the actual NFL.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. A lot of companies, especially that use React, because React is open source, it, like other companies that use it, end up developing stuff and releasing it also open source for the community to use. So they actually have a bunch of open source stuff that's used by the actual National Football League. They have their own GitHub. So we end up importing Helmet from React Helmet, and then anything like a regular tag that would go into our head of the document, we can just put inside of our Helmet, and that would be unique per component or page or really anything. So I'm going to add this to our application just because right now, if you open up our history, it just says React app, which is not very useful. So same thing like we did with React Router DOM. We're going to do an npm install on React Helmet. So that finished installing. And inside of our users page, we could do a couple different things. So because, again, we're importing layout into each page that we're using, we might not want to import the Helmet package into every single page that we're doing. Instead, what we could do is pass a property to layout that would be the title of our page. So in this case, I'm just going to do a title of example homepage. And inside of users, I'm going to do a title equals example users page. Save that. Now, right off the hop, this isn't doing anything. We can pass as many properties as we want to any sort of component. And if it's not doing anything with it, it just kind of ignores it. But just before we end up actually doing something with it, I'm going to show you in React DevTools now, inside of our browser router, we have our users page that's right here. We have users, I think. And then we have layout. So we can see the props that are being passed to it. So we see right here, it has title, example users page. But if I go to users, it re-renders, and now it has a title of example homepage. So React DevTools is pretty useful for being able to see what the state and props that are passed to components or are in components are doing. So now inside of our layout, we're going to import Helmet from React Helmet, and it's with a capital H. And then Helmet and title equals, title is going to be props.title. So now you can see, let me open this in a new tab so that we don't have any history. So we're on home, click users. Now it says example home page. Go back, example users page, and now it changes what's there. The only thing that is a potential issue is on the first load. Oh wait, hold on, that's home, that's fine, never mind. Okay, you can ignore that. I was gonna say sometimes like on the first load before React will end up loading, it will have what is ever the default inside of your index HTML file. So it won't know what to use unless if you're using some sort of server-side rendering for that. Yeah, so trying to think. So, sorry, I'm just brain fart trying to think where I am right now. So we've created our users page, our index page. We've used a layout. Oh, state. So what we should now be able to do is instead of having a component that is past stuff, we want to be able to house something, to being able to change something. And what you can use that for is for conditionally rendering something. So let's do inside of our users page, we're going to now convert this into a class component, which is pretty easy to do. What we just do is we say class users extends react.component. Nope, component. And then we'll have a function inside of it that's called render. And we put that return inside of it. So very quickly, we've now just converted this functional component into a class component. And this is now, for those of you that are familiar with object-oriented languages, we have a constructor that receives in props. We call super props, and then we say this dot state. And that's just going to be an empty object for now. So that way we can start to use it. So that's in our users page. So what is pretty common is depending on certain things in your application, you may want to render something specific, such as, you know, if they click a checkbox, you want to register, you know, or let's say you click a button and it pops up a modal. So instead of triggering that where the modal is already there and then you change it from being hidden to shown, what you can do inside of React is not even render that modal until they click that button. So what I'll do instead is just do a button. So I'm going to use a regular button with a class name of button primary. Click me. And I'm going to have a state of is clicked of false. So what I'm also going to be doing is right now, this button that we have put right here is not able to change the state value by default. You have to hook that up. So there's a couple different ways that you can do it. I'm going to create a function that's called handle button click. And what it's going to do is call, so you don't actually change values in state manually. That's the not good to do. So what we end up doing is React gives us a function that we can call that's called this.setState. And the reason for this is, are you guys familiar with the term mutations? So when you mutate something, it means that you change it without other stuff potentially knowing. So when you set state, it will change state, but it also calls a bunch of functions behind the scenes to know that a React component needs to re-render, or any of its children need to re-render. So it's a And what ends up happening is when you call this .set state, because this component will re-render, everything that's a child of it re-renders. So if for some reason a child also ends up setting state, you don't want to re-render something like 10, 15, 20 times, because every single time that it re-renders, it calls something else. So what this does is it puts it all into one single update that ends up happening, and it will re-render your entire UI for you. So in this case, so handle button click, what we're going to do is set is clicked to true, and then we're going to add a on click that's going to take our handle button click, but we have to say, sorry, this dot handle button click. Now, there's only one other issue with this, and you guys might not necessarily know it, but in order to access this, we actually have to bind handle button click to this. So what we can do is this. So we have to say this dot handle button click equals this dot handle button click dot bind this. And what it does is it allows it to access the this property for every single instance of the user's page to properly render. So now if that's there, I'm going to just render out this dot state dot is clicked dot toString. So it's false. I click it, it's true. If I click it again, it's still true, but it doesn't end up changing. So what we can do, we've now changed it from being true to false or false to true. You can do this dot state dot is clicked, and in this case, we want the opposite. So now click, true, click again, false, click, true, false, true, false. However, this is considered a little bit of bad practice. The reason being is because things constantly change in React, there's no guaranteed way of knowing, like if I click this really quickly and I clicked it twice when it was false, it would both times set it to true. Whereas you would want it to always set it to the opposite. So what we can do is instead of, yeah.
Instead of just changing that, can you comment that out, copy it, and change it?
Yes. Yeah. So what we can do is do this dot set state, and then we end up using an anonymous function. So what we can do is we get the state of what it is previously, and then we can return is clicked is equal to the previous state is clicked, and we want the opposite of that. So click this. So now it does the exact same thing because this is very simplistic. There's not a lot of stuff that's changing in the application, but you want, when you click something, you want the feedback to happen of what you saw at that time. You could, in theory, have something that ends up changing before that event fires, and then it wouldn't be what you're expecting. So in this case, when I click it, it takes whatever I see on the screen at that current time, and then it just does the opposite of it. Whereas I could click, there could be a delay that ends up, for some reason, this ends up being set to true, and then it just sets it back to false. So you wouldn't get what you're thinking would happen. So that's why this is a better practice as opposed to this. But both for this simplistic of an application will give you the exact same results. But what we would want to do is maybe we could change the text. Instead of it saying click me, we could end up changing the text from being turn off to turn on, and then we could even change the color of the button. So In this case, I'm just going to throw that on a new line. So we have the state. Usually what's easiest is I set is clicked to this dot state. So we just spread out the is clicked. So we say if is clicked, we want it to say turn off. Otherwise, we want it to say turn on. Oh. So we just have a little ternary operator. So now it says turn on, turn off, turn on, turn off. And we can change the class name that's here to change depending on if it's turned on or turned off. So we can do button, and then we say if is clicked, do button success, or no, button danger, or do button success. So now visually you'll be able to see that it fades between turn off and turn on. So does anyone have any questions about what we've done in the last little bit?
You sent it to GitHub?
Yes. Yep. Good question.
Question about that actually. If you clone from GitHub, do you have to still run like npm install and all that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. The reason for that is my node modules folder is not pushed up to GitHub. So when you download it, you have to run npm install. Now, what's nice about npm is when you run npm install, it will cache a lot of those dependencies on your computer. So the next time that you go to run it, it should be quicker unless if you've cleared cache or something like that.
Okay.
So using React Helmet, showing off state. Oh, and git push. Okay. So yeah, is there something that someone has like a good idea of maybe that we could use React with? Like, does someone have an idea of something that might make it more easier to understand how this works? Anyone want to see something? Okay, so I'm going to take, there's probably, I'm going to go to npm and look for a React YouTube. So there's a React YouTube component that you give it some stuff. So in this case, it has a bunch of functions that you can give to it. So on ready, on play, on pause, you can end up creating stuff that happens in your application when that happens. So I'm going to npm install React YouTube. I've never used it before, so should be good. Okay. And now I'm going to import YouTube from React YouTube. Okay. So I don't care about this. But what I'm going to do is make it so that it only displays the YouTube video if we're in a on position. Oops. And And we're just going to grab a YouTube video. Hopefully this isn't loud. Oh, okay. We're in M110, right? I don't know. I can apparently. Oh, that's for AirPlay. Maybe this one. Let's make sure the volume is not all the way up. Okay. Well, it doesn't really matter if the volume's working or not. It's almost better that it isn't. So now I just take the ID that's from the video, throw it in here, and we don't care about any onReady. So it's going to autoplay when it's open. So now I turn it on. Turn it off, reopen it. So, yeah. So there's like, obviously you can extend off of this and you can do a lot of different hiding, showing stuff based on current state. In fact, what is, like, it doesn't even obviously have to be a true or false value. So what you could end up doing is displaying certain parts of your application based on like different values. Like when you're in, let's say, like a cart checkout, usually you would have step 1, step 2, step 3, and you don't want to necessarily have to push them to a new page to do that. So you could end up having a step. So let's say current step is 1, and I'm going to build this really quickly. So steps.jsx, import react, const step equals const steps equals that, export default steps, and in here we want to accept props, return, and let's see, const mount equals array dot, is it array from fill, okay. And then in here, I want to do a mount.map AI step key equals I and render I. And this is only going to render a div and then props.children. What is that saying? Fatal token expectations. Oh, it's supposed to be in a div. Actually, the easiest would be this, save. Okay. So, I know that was really quick. You weren't necessarily, like, you don't have to like copy it down, but just to show this, so I go back, I want to render components, and I want my steps component. And I also want to know the const current step equals props.current. So if or is current equals I equals current step. Missing something, sorry. There, okay. And is current equals is current. And then we'll just leave that there for now. Okay. So now inside of our users, I just created a step and a steps component. And what it should do is I have steps. I want the amount to be 5. And I want the current to be 2. So now inside of here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can make this all side by side. If I just did a div with a style of display flex. So now I have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm just going to do some more styling just to make this easier. Padding is going to be 2 rem around, and background color is going to be red. What's that saying? No, I don't need a semicolon. So in this case, when you're using JSX, you actually do it as like a JavaScript object. So you'll notice usually background color is not with a capital C. It's background dash color. But because of it being JSX, it will automatically convert that in, and you don't have to worry about any semicolons. So if that's something that usually trips you up, because sometimes you forget, bonus, you don't have to worry about it. OK, so have that. I'm also going to add, I'm going to do a padding of that and a margin of 1 rem as well. And I'm also going to justify content to center. Okay. So now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And what I can do is basically say background color equals props dot, because this is being passed as a Boolean, so I can just say props dot is current. If it's current, we want the background color to be blue. Otherwise, we want it to be red. And then I can just remove this part here and just use that. So now I have that. And inside of here, I can just change the current amount to being like 3, or 1, or 0. And you can see how by changing this, if this was in state, so I'm going to create a second button that will just be called increment. And the on click is going to be called this.increment. I'm going to create a function called increment. And so current step is going to be 0. Max steps is going to be 5. And let me just make this full screen. So the current we want to be our state value. So we can say this.state.current step. And our mount, we can say this.state.max steps. So it's still the exact same values. But what we'll do is when we click the button, we will increment it. So increment, we need to bind, so that way we can use this. And we'll say this.setState prev state, and we need max step or current step. So current step equals prev state dot current step plus 1. I can actually, and then I'm going to use modulus prev state dot max steps and return current step. Comments. Okay. So now I can increment it. Oop. And it will change what the current step is on. So if for some reason you're wondering, this is like a handy little calculation to know if you're using something that's kind of like a carousel or something that slides through multiple things. But let's see. So increment current step by 1, set to 0 if modulus, and return new state. Okay. So yeah, so that's kind of like the intro to being able to use React. Now, for assignment 2, it did say to use React. I'm not going to force you to use React. You're welcome to do it. I just think today wouldn't necessarily be good for trying to implement React into our Express application, just because there is some little things that you have to do to get it to work properly, and it can be a little bit confusing. So I will not take off marks if you do not use React in your assignment 2, but I definitely encourage it, just because I personally find it's a lot easier to write React over Pug, even though Pug is, I don't know, pretty good. So yeah, does anyone have any questions right now? Yes?
So does React work alongside Pug?
No. So because Pug is the templating engine that's used on the back end, as I said, like once you send off a template, you can't update it anymore. So you can do, you can create like the interface of what your Pug would look like. And then the only issue is React, the reason why we mount onto an empty div is because it will just blow away anything that's underneath it. So once React mounts onto it, it's basically it's React's game. It's not anything else. There is something that's called hydrating that allows you to, if it matches it, it will just hydrate over it, and then it'll give you all the front end tools that you want to be able to do on the front end. But it's a little bit harder to do it with Pug, which is why there's what's called server-side rendering. So on the documentation here, you'll see if I open up view page source, it actually has all of the React code that's inside of it. And then once the React library renders, it will hydrate on top of it and then give you that, accessibility of being able to just switch between without having to change pages. So yeah, so to answer that, there's no templating engine that is super useful at being able to do that, but there are some things that we can do if you're wanting to for server-side rendering, not today. But yeah, so to answer your question, no, they don't work too well together. But that's why I'm not making it a requirement on the assignment. It's just because it's hard to do. Any other questions? No. Okay. So yeah, so next week we will try to implement it a little bit with React, implement React with Express. We'll set up using Express more as an API rather than serving up content. So that way, when we can create a form in React that will try to log in or request information, and it will just automatically push it up on the screen. So yeah, that's class.